Hello, and welcome to another Sick Career podcast. Today, I am really excited to have a former colleague of mine and now someone I call a friend, although I called him a friend also while he was a colleague of mine at Google, Rob Cox. Rob, I met during my time at Google when I was trying to eject myself from a very difficult situation on the ad side of the business and looking to go over to the cloud side of the business, and our paths crossed. And I just really learned to appreciate a lot about Rob and what he stood for, and he was just a straight shooter. So, with that, let me just introduce Rob and tell the sick audience here a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. Alan, I appreciate having me, and I appreciate sort of remaining in touch through all these years because that's sort of fun too. So, I am from San Francisco, and if we just focus on my career, I have in effect worked at sort of two large companies and now two relatively smaller ones. So I started my career in sales at IBM. I was in inside sales in their call center in Smyrna, Georgia. Moved out here in 2000. Moved out to San Francisco in 2000 with IBM. I did a very short stint at a company called Opsware, which was what Andreessen and Horowitz did after Netscape, before Andreessen and Horowitz, and then went back to IBM shortly. And after leaving IBM, joined Google. I was at Google from when Google Cloud was in a singular room, all the way to Google Cloud as we know it today. And then about a year ago, I left to join Vimeo. Vimeo is in a similar place to where Google was, where it was a B2C brand, now looking to be a B2B brand. And sort of that transition is just, it was a ton of fun for me the first time. And I'm hoping it'll be a ton of fun the second time.
Very cool. And you and I, when we first met, I think we wound up talking a lot of shop about, we're passionate about a couple of different things that make us kind of like birds of a feather. One of them was we're very focused on people development and recruiting and hiring and growing talent. And the second thing is we're both focused, even though we're both pasty white dudes, or you appear to be one. We're maybe you're not as pasty as me, but we're both white dudes that care about diversity. So let's talk about the first. Well, let's talk about the first piece on the diversity side, and then let's dig into the Google interview process and how you attack it, how I attack it, and what recommendations we have. On the diversity front, I've explained a bunch of why I'm passionate about it, but I'd love to hear why you care about building diverse teams, recruiting diverse talent, and what I know that's something that you are proactively passionate about and have made some good inroads in. So what drives that desire of yours?
Yeah. And I mean, the way that I think about it is, as a cisgendered white male, right, my objective is to be an ally to the folks that are underrepresented. And, this, we cannot proclaim ourselves to be allies. Only the people we're trying to serve can say that we're allies, right? So I try and keep that in mind, where this activity is a service activity. It's not necessarily something that I get to put on my resume or things like that. But I mean, I think about kind of diversity through a couple of different lenses. I think first and foremost, the very best teams I've been a part of have been teams that are diverse. And I've run into a lot of places where they'll have a room full of people that all look the same, but then the proclamation is, yeah, but we have diversity of thought here. And I think my reaction to that is like, do you? Do you? Yeah. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, doesn't so votes this way and we vote that way. Okay. I'm not sure that's diversity of thought. I think it's literally, people that grew up with a different frame just bring a lot from a business perspective. Right. And so I think that was kind of my entree into it. And as a white person, I came into diversity very much through a gender lens. I mean, gender, I think, is easier for men because we all have a mother. So that's sort of an easy way to be able to relate to women. And then a lot of the work that I did as I was at Google was really trying to get more more depth on my understanding of racial equity and social justice, um, and become comfortable talking about race. And I'll never proclaim to be all the way there, right? Like there are nuances to all of this that I will never understand. But I want to, perpetually try and get better. Um, and so I look at it very much as a way to get a better team. And now that I've done a lot of my training, and I've sort of sought to get better, and I've sought to have more friends in my life who are persons of color and that type of thing, a little bit of my fairness button kicks in too, where I'm trying to kind of do my little part to create a little bit more of an even playing field. But you'd asked about this idea of sort of creating a diverse team. And the way I think about it is not unique. But the way that I think about it is I take the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and I think about it backwards. Meaning, if you don't create an inclusive environment, you don't have the basis to build any sort of team that is diverse, because nobody will see themselves in your actions. Nobody will see themselves in the things that you do. They won't feel comfortable in the organization, right? And so you have to sort of be inclusive in thought and inclusive in word and inclusive in deed as a leader to set the standard. And then equity, I spend a bunch of time thinking about, who gets paid what, and are we creating environments that we can sort of create pay equity? Are there places on my team where that there is disequity in compensation? Compensation's one. Are there places on the team where there's disequity in opportunity, right? And so in the areas that I can control, I try and think about equity. And I think if you do the first two things right, you'll wind up with diversity in your organization, because people who are underrepresented will invariably communicate with one another and say, hey, this organization is different. This is a place where somebody that looks like us, who thinks like us, who acts like us, who does whatever, can flourish. And so I won't say that I'm able to accomplish this every single day, Alan, but I think, I think about it that way. And I contrast that to what I hear from a lot of leaders, which is they look at diversity as like a pure recruiting exercise. And so it's a numbers game of sort of, is my candidate pool diverse? Is my candidate pool reverse? Is my candidate pool diverse? And then if my candidate pool is diverse, then I'm more likely to hire a diverse candidate, all of this type of stuff. And I agree with those things, but I think if you haven't actually built an inclusive team, then you're tokenizing the people that you're targeting, and you're not sort of trying to do what you can to solve what is really a difficult, gnarly institutional problem.
So it sounds like you take an approach where you're trying to build it like inside out. So you build that inclusive culture from within your team, and then you become kind of a talent magnet for some of that diverse talent that might come your way.
That's the hope. Right, that's the hope. And then I'm also hoping that sort of reputationally I can attract underrepresented talent. So let's say that I'm building a new team from scratch. I'm hoping that reputationally I can be seen as an individual that can really help individuals that are underrepresented flourish. Right. So it's sort of building a brand, which makes me feel a little uncomfortable to frame it that way, but building a brand as somebody that can help underrepresented talent move their careers where they want it to. And then ultimately building an organization where underrepresented talent feels like they've got at least equal access to opportunity and equal opportunity to really grow in an equitable way.
So, and you're a hiring manager. You've been a hiring manager for 10 plus years or so, or maybe more at multiple
maybe
different,
more at this point. Yeah.
At multiple different companies. So you're creating this inclusive environment, but then you're kind of dependent upon the recruiting organization to get you some candidates that are diverse. And you say it's not a numbers game on the slate of candidates, but if you get like 5 white people or 3 white people and 2 Asian people, it's really hard to hire a Black or Latinx individual. So Correct. I've always had challenges with getting those diverse candidates coming to my plate. Have you had those challenges as well? And if so,
sure.
How have you tried to proactively attract? Like, you have a good
Yeah.
reputation within your team, but you need
Mm-hmm.
recruiters to work with you to get you that talent. So how have you tried to source that talent, either yourself or through putting some pressure on the recruiting team?
So I take uh, recruiting and the act of recruiting and the act of sourcing very personally. And so it is something where actually bringing somebody on board is what's the word, sort of challenging, or I know that it's going to be daunting, because I'm spending an awful lot of time on LinkedIn, um, looking through my network and my extended network, trying to reach talent. And look, there are times in my past where I would identify an individual based on their picture or something like this on LinkedIn, and I would be reaching out to people cold as the hiring manager, to say like, hey, we've got this opportunity. Would love for you to come compete. So I don't necessarily view hiring as something that I can sort of solely delegate to uh, recruiting. Right? I am personally involved. I ask that the managers who work for me are also to be personally involved. I mean, I sort of give them the same speech, right? Which is like, look, left to their own devices, we're likely to get kind of the same kind of candidates that we've gotten in the past. So like, let's be a part of the change and let's go get something that is not necessarily, the hires that we've been making. And then the one trick that I found in working with staffing is, well, there's two really. One, the staffing folks that I've worked with have become almost sort of the closest friends in my life. So because I take such a hands-on approach to this, like I try and stand out from other hiring managers because I'm hands-on, because I'm involved, because I'm interested in what they do, because I'm responsive to screening resumes. Like think about being a recruiting person and
Yeah.
all the things that are terrible about
Yep.
working with a hiring manager. I deliberately try and be the opposite of that. So I try and be, because I know my standards are high. We're going to talk about interviewing, I'm sure, at some point. Like I know that there are elements of what I do that are pain in the butt to them. So I try and make the things that I can control for them easier. But then my request of any sort of sourcing activity that we're able to get dedicated to the roles that I have open is, I want the sourcing folks to really focus on underrepresented talent
Mm-hmm.
almost exclusively. Right. So like if I have resource, that's where I want the resource to be planted. And look, there's going to be guys who look like us who are hearing something like this and in effect have a reaction along the lines of like, that's not fair. And I get that, and I'm empathetic to the point, right? Because I don't necessarily want to be overlooked for potential positions based on what I am or what have you. Um, my experience has been, though, the world teaches folks like us, Alan, that we punch above our weight. Kind of regardless of the room that we're in, we punch above our weight, and that's sort of a little bit of what the world reinforces to us. And so, as a consequence, a lot of the inbound applications that I tend to get are from representative groups.
Yep.
So I wind up with a diverse candidate pool, from super talented individuals who apply in, and then the outward work that I do and staffing does, and the people who work for me do. I like that sort of balance, and that's a way that I've gotten, a balanced candidate pool. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I don't
Yep.
get it right every single time, but that's at least the objective when we start a search.
Yeah, and I think that's great on the proactive sourcing. I think you're trying to over-index on that, and there are
Right.
primarily three points of entry into, like, when you post a role, there's three general points of entry. There's cold applications that come in. So if you post a role on your team with Venmo, anybody can go to the Venmo's website and find a role and apply for that. And there's lots of research there that people that are overrepresented are more comfortable applying for roles, that even if the application says something that only like 7 out of the 10 things that they're good at, they will still get the application, and women will often opt out and not apply. So you have
Correct.
an under index of diverse individuals there. Then the other
Mm-hmm.
channel is referrals. And
Yep.
referrals, white people know more white people. Like, even though you and I
Correct.
are both diverse, I bet you have more white friends because of the neighborhood that you might live in or the
Sure.
work environment that you live in. So those referrals also are very over indexed to the overrepresented. So
Yep.
what you're doing, I think, makes tons of sense is on the sourcing side, the proactive efforts that you have your recruiters focus on is, hey, you should over index on diverse population. So that's only one third of the point of entry,
Yeah.
but at least there you're over indexing there. So it's not like, yeah. So
Totally.
first off, I don't want any white dudes complaining that, hey, these guys are trying not to hire white dudes, but the white people and people like white women and anyone can come in through those first two channels. And what you're saying is on the third channel, on the proactive sourcing, just over index on trying to level the playing field.
I love the way you've summarized it with one exception. So I work for Vimeo, not Venmo.
Oh, I'm sorry. Vimeo.
Vimeo
yes,
is
I know it's a video one.
Video
it's
space.
Yeah, I totally know that, and I confuse the names because the first and last letter.
And the logos are similar, and they're both blue, and so this is not the first time I've heard that, but it is in fact Vimeo.
Yeah.
But you reminded me of something as you were talking, which I agree with, which is, so I often hear people say, like, and this is sort of a code for hiring an overrepresented person. It's like, well, we want to hire the best candidate. And the counter to that is, look, I agree with you. Like, I don't actually put my thumb in the scale in the interview process based on what people are. But my contention is you cannot understand that you have the best candidate if your pool wasn't inclusive in the first place. So if you don't have an inclusive pool, you are, and you're only sourcing sort of one demographic, the odds that you're getting to the best candidate are quite low. Unless, there's sort of something else that you're saying by, like, I only want to hire the best candidate, like as a code for, and that's a white male or something along those lines. Like those are deeper problems that you've got to work out with your therapist or whatever. But go create a diverse candidate pool. And then in having a diverse candidate pool, you can actually go find the candidate who is best. And sometimes that's a white person. Sometimes that's a black person. Like you have to go through the process at that particular point. But at the minimum, the top of the funnel looks the way that you could have an outcome that somebody's underrepresented, and it's not an aberration.
Yep. Makes total sense. And I think you and I are a little bit of outliers of, I think I also had really strong relationships with a lot of recruiters. I was very involved. I would be very quick on responsiveness. I developed some strong relationships with recruiters. I also rubbed some recruiters the wrong way because I wanted them to work hard working with me. And you and I are like, but there's nothing mandating you or I to ask for that diverse slate of candidates, because there's other hiring managers that typically will just tell the recruiter, just get me someone here quickly. I need like 4 or 5 people to get to the final round.
Well, yeah. And look, at some point we're going to transition to interviewing, but I think that's right. Is there's this, I think it's a misperception because, again, I think you can kind of get in a groove. But there's a perception that, like, well, I can hire fast or I can hire diverse. Which one would you like?
Yeah, you can do both.
And again, I sort of throw that out to like, I push that across the table on principle, which is, you can do both. And also, like, at least in my career, you've kind of have a little bit more of a diverse background than that, but, like, neither one of us has been saving lives as a part of our thing. So there's never been this pressure of, like, I need somebody in here in 24 hours or people will start to die. Right? Like, we're not hiring ER nurses or something along those lines. We're selling people, or we're trying to find people, at least in my world, who can sell ones and zeros. Like, 48 hours, or sort of the relative time difference. I'm not sure it's critical. And again, I sort of dismiss that argument on its face that you cannot have a diverse candidate pool and a quickly sourced candidate pool. Like, I guess I would challenge to say, and I do talk about this with the managers who work for me, like, you're almost kind of perpetually sourcing, right? Whether you actually have an open role or not, like, you're just sort of, in the course of doing your job, you're meeting people and you're sort of doing a, like, hey, maybe that would be something I work. But, like, you're always sort of looking for what's out there. so that it's not a standing start each time you get the opportunity to hire somebody.
Yeah. So let's get into some inside baseball talk of
Sure.
interviewing. How many
Yeah. And I
interviews do
wore
you
my
think?
Google Cloud,
Nice,
swag from the old days just for this to
nice.
prove my bona fides.
I got lots of swag back here too, but I'm just wearing my Kadima swag, so that's all I
There you
got
go.
here.
I like it.
That was
You got to pimp the brand.
I got that. I got Yeti tumblers here. That was one of the biggest things that I miss about working in big tech is the amazing swag. I
The
still have a lot.
stuff. Mm-hmm.
Um, but how many interviews do you think you've conducted in your career, and how many of those would you estimate are at Google? Like just to
I
like
actually
just
know. No, I know the answer to this question because, as you remember, right? Google used to keep track of this,
yeah, yeah.
and so in the end, and I've got a friend in my mind right now who will fact check this and let me know after. But in the end, I had done over 700 interviews, and if I remember correctly, I think the number was 750.
Okay,
Um, and in a year at Vimeo added to that, I don't think I've cracked 800 just yet, but I will probably have done well in advance of 1,000 interviews before I stop working for sure.
nice. So if you have a friend who can fact check this, I would love to know my number because I know I did 225 in the year 2015 because I was the second most
Yeah.
across all of Google.
Well, oh, the
Only beaten
question
by
is
like
whether we're in the database still. Like, do we exist,
yeah,
or did they just sort of take us out? And those
yeah.
interviews have gone the
If
way
you
of the great Buffalo.
if you have a friend who can fact check that, have them fact check me too because I think I did about 500 to 800 during my time at Google, but
Okay.
I know I did 225 in 2015.
In that one year, yep.
Yeah. So so I would consider you an expert interviewer, expert at Google
Mm-hmm.
interviews. Let's dig into the Google's
Mm-hmm.
interview. So
Sure.
Google's interview, and you can correct me if I'm wrong as I summarize this. They predominantly it goes through this process. You have a recruiter screen. The recruiter makes sure
Mm-hmm.
that you are. It's usually a 30-minute chat, and then they will push you through to the hiring manager. Then the hiring manager, which was often you or me, would
Yep.
chat with the individual and say, okay, this person is worthy of an on site or loops or panel interview. And then they would
Mm-hmm.
get scheduled for usually a full day of four
Mm-hmm.
interviews focusing on four different attributes. One is
Mm-hmm.
role related knowledge, or Google called it RRK. Secondly, was leadership. Third was GCA, which is general cognitive ability. And fourth is
Mm-hmm.
googliness.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, everybody would put in their information, and Google did a pretty good job of not having groupthink. So people would do it in a secretive manner of submitting their feedback
Mm-hmm.
and theoretically not talking to one another, although there were teams that did that. And then you would
Mm-hmm.
get into the room and you would evaluate 4 to 5 candidates, and you would come to a decision of who of those are hireable and which one's the best. And then you'd go to make, then you'd go to the panel review, or what do they call it?
Mm-hmm.
The
Hiring committee.
hiring committee, and hiring committee would have to sign off, and then an offer would go out.
Mm-hmm.
So is that
Mm-hmm.
factually accurate?
So you describe what is probably the classic Google interview process. And look, if anybody's ever interested in it, like Laszlo Bach in the book
Yeah.
Work Rules details
Yeah.
all of this in a great way.
Great book.
You describe the classic one. What I will say is, in my time at Cloud, some of those things evolved because of the volume of hiring that Cloud was doing. So, I'll give you a couple of examples. Like, we did combine leadership and Googliness into a single interview. So it was 3 interviews, not 4.
Okay.
We did. There were sort of debriefs that were broad scale. When we were trying to hire lots and lots of people, we would do a debrief over like tens of candidates, something along those lines. And then I don't remember exactly how it worked. I was on hiring committee a bit and I was off of it, but I think there was also a little bit of a tweak to hiring committee over the years that sort of said, we're going to review exceptions. So in other words, if sort of the whole interview panel is all agrees, we're cool. If not, the hiring committee will review it and in effect break ties. And so what I would just say to your listeners is your mileage may vary because you laid it out classically. My data is now a year old. It could be in a state of evolution, but I think what you described is my understanding of generally the things that Google is looking for, and so you can sort of think along those lines. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I have clients that are currently getting interviewed by Google, and it's generally the
Mm-hmm.
same. Sometimes you'll have exceptions to rules where they're trying to hire quickly, or someone has already
Yep.
been through the loops already, and it's just a faster rubber stamp. But generally, that's the process with a couple of tweaks.
Mm.
And so you and I both would generally focus on the same area, GCA, general cognibility.
Yes.
So of
Yeah.
those 750 interviews that you did at Google, the vast majority, I would imagine, were GCA focused for you.
80%, 90%, something along those lines. Yeah.
Me too. I like digging into
Yeah.
that. And I actually really hate the googliness one, because googliness actually, in my mind, leads to lack of diversity, because everybody has a different perspective of googliness. And what I think
Yep.
is googly is different than what someone else thinks is googly. And most of those people that are interviewing are
Mm-hmm.
skews similar to the population of Google. So we
Yep.
won't get into that, but that's just something I would. But I would
I
always
agree with
pick
you.
people for my interview panel, someone that I knew was a good judge of character, that I would like trust, like it was this woman Rachel, or like I had a couple of people on my team that I was like, okay, I trust them in terms of their
Well,
perspective.
could we start there? Because
Yeah,
I think the people that I tend to select for an interview panel is like an important part of the
yeah,
process for me, right? So what I'm looking for in an interview panel is I'm trying to think who is likely to disagree with me,
mm, yeah,
and I have a very good friend of mine, Lindsay Scrace, who was a longtime Googler, and she and I joked about how we would always end up on the opposite sides of candidates. And the joke was when she and I found somebody that we both agreed on, because I think in general what would happen between she and I is we'd sort of get this like, can you live with him? Because we trusted one another's judgment. Can you live with him? Can you live with her? We trusted one another's judgment, but we'd have reservations. But the point where the Venn diagram overlapped and we both found a candidate that we were like ecstatic about, we knew that person was going to be able to be unstoppable. And there were a handful of those that got through. But I was always interested in folks who had a rigorous approach to interviewing and would develop an opinion that was based on what they saw in the interview, and then represent that point of view with some oomph behind it. Right. I'm not interested in, if you're sort of wishy-washy or you're able to be swayed by the group. Like I just don't think you make a good interview panelist.
yeah.
And the Vimeo people laugh at me. So one of the things that's a part of Vimeo's interview process is we all show up to a Zoom meeting, and the whole panel. And the first thing we do is everybody sort of closes their eye, or like there's a countdown, and then you do a thumb. So you do thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down. The idea being like you all sort of show at once so that nobody influences anybody else. And the staffing, this is part of where I drive staffing crazy, is I'm like, I think that's dumb. We shouldn't do that. I don't want to do that anymore. And my rationale for it is I want the people who are not going to change their opinion. Like if I'm thumbs down, I don't want somebody to be like, oh, well, Rob's thumbs down, I got to change my vote. Like
Yeah.
I want people who are going to sort of hear others' perspectives and say, well, I hear what you're saying. Here's what I saw in my interview, and think about it that way. So I'm always looking for. I don't need people that are full of bias, but I need people that are convicted in their opinion, based on what they saw in the interview, and are able to interview to the rubrics, and then defend the position that they developed as a result of the conversation.
And that's something that you probably, I don't know if Vimeo did that always, but a lot of companies do not do a good job of eliminating the bias and eliminating that group
Right.
think. Google did a good job of
Yep.
that. Salesforce did not when I was there.
Okay.
Tableau did not. And I actually use that to my advantage if I wanted to push a candidate through, but it's not the right way to hire. And I appreciated
That's
the
right.
fact that Google or like with Vimeo, like everybody puts in their information, puts in their answers without being swayed. and then you can
Right.
talk, and maybe then you can sway
Yep.
somebody, but
Sure.
at least the information is out there. So
Yep.
you would focus on GCA. I would focus on GCA,
I would.
general
Yeah.
cognitive ability. Let's dig into there a
Hmm.
little bit. I
Yeah.
what are and with general cognitive ability at Google, and I'm sure you're doing this at Vimeo as well. And I've done this. Like this is what I really care about with people. Like I care about their
Yes.
attributes and their values, but I want to make sure I'm hiring
Hmm.
smart people.
Yeah.
And not that they need to know how many golf balls can fill up a school bus, which Google used
Did
to ask that
you?
question.
I was going to say, but was that a part of your Google interview process? Did you have a brain teaser? Are you of
So
that
I
generation?
it was not eliminated at that point. So when I interviewed in
Okay.
2011, I was preparing for questions like that, and I was
Yeah.
told by somebody that hey, the person who's interviewing you came from McKinsey, so he is going to be interviewing you in case-based interview questions. So I read books on case-based interviewing and got
Hmm.
prepared for that. It didn't really wind up coming, but I prepared for that.
Sure. Yeah.
My interview actually, we won't go too far into there, but I had like no, I had like one real tough interview where I was sweating bullets, and they were pressure testing
Mm,
me on whether Android should be open source or close, like a closed garden, like
yeah.
Apple iPhone at the time. And I wasn't even
Hmm.
interviewing for a mobile role, but they were just like digging into
Hmm.
my opinion. But talk to me about how you would assess GCA, general cognitive ability,
Yeah.
and I love your go-to question. If you have a question or two, and I'll share mine too.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to. So, first and foremost, I don't think about it as an intelligence test, right? And I think I think Google got rightfully a little bit gun shy on sort of assessing intelligence as a result of this interview. Like I don't think I'm administering an IQ test. I don't think I'm testing for sort of intelligence. What I think I'm what I say to candidates. So I start off by saying, look, this interview is about testing your approach to problem solving,
Mm-hmm.
and um, and I'll give the rest of sort of my opening script in a moment. But I think about it's about problem solving, and the places that I've worked, what I've always been attracted to are sort of the unstructured, we've got to figure it out, there is no playbook, the manual doesn't exist type of opportunities. Well, if you hire people who are totally reliant upon the manual in order to be successful, they're not going to be happy in a very unstructured environment. So call it problem solving, call it ambiguity tolerance, call it what you want. But what I'm trying to assess in that 45 minutes or an hour is can you actually sort of solve a problem that you did not prepare for? Right. And so what I say to candidates up front is I say, look, this is about assessing your approach to problem solving. Uh, I'm going to ask you a question where you probably don't have any domain expertise. And what I want you to do is walk me through how you would address the problem using a framework that I'm going to give you. And then I pause and I say, look, I've seen a lot of people get sort of white as I start to talk about the framework and the question and whatever, when they realize they don't have anything to write with. So are you like, you don't have to, but if you'd like to go get a pen, I will just pause right now if you'd like to go get a pen to write with. And so what's funny to me these days is I have all these people like, everybody holds up a pen and shows me. It's like, no, I don't need you to prove it to me. I believe you. I'm just giving you an opportunity. But then I actually give them, Alan, I give them the framework. And I say, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you to walk me through the steps you take to prepare. I want you to, once you've, and look, Vimeo loves data. We love database decisions. You're not going to have any data. So I'm interested in who are you talking to? What are you looking for? Where are you looking for data? How are you going to apply that data? That type of thing. But like, what are you doing to prepare? And then the second part is ideation. So I'm looking for you to popcorn a number of different ideas out. Whether they work or not is immaterial, but I'm just sort of looking at how creative and how expansive can you be on your ideas. And then the third part of the framework is I'm looking for you to walk me through the solution, or walk me through the approach you take to selecting a solution. right? Preparation, ideation, and solution identification. I think Google's were something. There were 4 of them within Google: preparation, discovery, solution identification, solution support. I think those were, and then there was an articulation one. So Google assessed more than what I was telling the candidate, but I give that to them up front. So I tell them exactly how I want them to answer the question, and I tell them exactly what I'm trying to assess. And then at the end of the day, I ended up in my time at Google more or less using one question, right? And that question was: imagine you are in charge of, I think you're sort of in charge of a project, or you're in charge of a product where 20% of users that go to the website for support then call in for additional support. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how would you cut that number in half? How would you move from 20% to 10%?
Yep.
And what I love about that question is everybody can relate to looking on a website for support, right? So everybody, if you're a consumer, if you're B2B, if you're whatever, like, you can relate to that. And it also has a number of directions to go, which are all about scale. And sort of how do you approach solving a problem at sort of like a website scale, where you can't call everybody individually and you can't sort of address them all. You've got to be thinking about, okay, I have billions of users. What do I do at that scale? So that's how I approach it from a candidate perspective. And then what my go-to question was when I was at Google.
Right, and you would mostly use that question and then just continue to probe and dig into their thought process.
Yeah. And so I'd given him the framework. So I'd be like, okay, let's start doing preparation. Who are you going to talk to? What are you going to ask? How are you going to think through this? And I think one of the things that you and I talked about was, so generally I would try not to prompt them, right? As a candidate gets more senior, I try to provide less prompting. If they're sort of more early in their career, I provide a little bit more prompting. But if they're advanced in their career, I provide very little, and I want to sort of see how they'll organize themselves. But for earlier career folks, I would say, okay, well, who are you talking to? What are you thinking about with the users, right? And the users' demographics. And one of the things that I always used to ask was, I would pick a country and be asking about the users and the website. And so I would say, like, look, if you noticed that a whole bunch of users from Germany were hitting the site and then going somewhere else, what might that tell you? Right. And it's so funny, because what I'm looking for is an obvious answer, which is the website's not in the language that these people speak. But I would get all kinds of things like, well, maybe the internet is down in their area, or maybe we don't have a product that serves that particular market, or whatever. And so what I was testing for in that particular kind of test was, are you trying to impress me with sort of how complicated you can make your thinking? Or are you willing to just sort of go to the sort of more bog obvious, like, well, maybe this stupid website isn't in a language that these people speak, and that's something that we should go fix.
Right.
I think I even brought that up to you when we chatted not too long ago. Like, that to me was a great indicator of all kinds of stuff.
Yep. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you use that, but I think you use Japan. But yeah, it could work in Japan. It could work in Germany, wherever.
Yeah. And it was particularly interesting, and I think you highlighted this. It's particularly interesting to do that with candidates from the US.
Yes.
Right? Because it's a little bit of, as Americans, like, this is something I imagine you'll get a kick out of that I hadn't figured out in however many years of living. There is no word for what a citizen of the United States is. Right? We call ourselves Americans, but Canadians are Americans and Mexicans are Americans. Like, There is no word. No word. It's just like, we just don't think. But for Americans, like, I'm trying to sort of I'm trying to assess, like, can you think with a global mindset here? Right. And it gets a little bit into inclusion, right? But it also sort of says, like, can you be empathetic to people who are not you?
Yeah.
Right? There's a whole group of people in Japan who pretty much all speak Japanese.
Yep.
Can you think through their viewpoint on the world, or are you just so sort of rooted in the way that you think about the world?
Yeah, and especially for the companies that you and I have worked for, they're global organizations, and you need to have that perspective. It
Totally.
was new. It was new to me coming from American Express, which was they called themselves a global company, although I think 90% of
Mhm.
their business comes from America. It's called American
Yeah.
Express. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that was a bit of a culture shock for me initially as I came in
Yeah.
leading a global team. So I might have failed on that question coming in. So I'm glad I didn't interview with you when I came into Google. My
Yeah.
go-to question, and I would ask a few more questions, but my big one was say that um, Sundar decided that all of a sudden we're going to start charging $5 per month for personal Gmail use. What do you think of that idea? And then I would ask,
Yeah.
let people talk about that. Then I would ask them to size the market. And I don't think that is
Ooh.
a golf ball in a bus
No.
situation, but I want to think about how they would size that market, what the opportunity is, and like how they think about potential attrition of people if you charge the so anyway, I would dig
I
in
love
there,
that. Yeah.
and I've had some people that have answered it terribly of saying, "Oh, we should do it. It's a big opportunity." And I was like, "How big of an opportunity is it?" And they're like, "Oh, millions
Right.
of dollars." It's like, first off, you're off by at least three
Your
zeros.
order of
Yeah,
magnitude. Right.
and secondly, how do you even come up with that? So anyway, but the
Yeah.
good people would dig in and start to think
Yep.
about, okay, here's what the global population is, and here are people that are on the internet, and here's Google's market share, and think about attrition and so forth.
I have to believe too, you had a little bit of lenience where that's the type of question where there actually probably is a right answer. Like you could actually go, if you had enough time and resource, you could go get to like, well, the reduction in advertising revenue would be this, the
Yeah.
increase would be that, the attrition would be like, you could probably go figure it out. But you probably had a bunch of tolerance for people,
Oh, yeah.
being way off as long as their thought process was sort of clear in how they were doing it. Like if you assumed that there are 4 billion people on Earth when there are closer to 8 billion people on Earth, like to me, that wouldn't be a dingable moment.
No,
It's just sort of like,
no.
I care about your assumptions, not that you did, right? Not that you did any sort of, not that your assumptions are accurate. I care about you had
Yeah,
assumptions, you documented the assumption, and then you sort of follow the logic all the way through and complete.
totally cool. But what I sometimes would expose through that is people were just thinking
Yeah.
about the US market. They're like, oh, there are 300 million
Yeah.
people in the US. It was like, well, is Gmail a US product or a global product? And
That's right.
so,
Yeah.
but it would be interesting there. So, we're running a little low on time. So I
Sure.
just want to ask a few more questions of you.
Yeah.
So you have interviewed hundreds of people. You've
Mm-hmm.
interviewed
Mm-hmm.
a number of times yourself as well to get these
I
jobs.
have.
What
Yep.
are some common mistakes that you see people make in interviews that maybe are just some easy fixes that they can either prepare for or rectify?
So bear in mind, like you and I have exposed, I'm a little bit specialized in the
Yeah.
way that I interview. But when people mistake the sort of exercise that I'm trying to put them through with a cognitive ability interview, with this GCA interview, for an opportunity to sort of inject things from their resume, that's something that's unrecoverable. It's not that I'm disinterested in their resume. It's not that I'm disinterested in their experience, but the answer to a hypothetical is not, well, it's just like this time at whatever where I did the fill in the blank. Like I've told you up front that I'm trying
Mm-hmm.
to assess how you approach problem solving. I'm not necessarily interested in your experience. There are other elements of the interview process where we're going to get that.
Yeah.
So that one is one that is very, very hard to recover from and easily preventable. Just listen very carefully to what the interviewer is asking of
Yes.
you, and just assure that and even repeat it back. So what you want me to do is this. This is the framework. This is the question. Let me make sure I got it right. So I think that's sort of the easiest preventable one. I like you, and this is part of the basis of our friendship. Have some sort of things that annoy me that are probably preventable. For example, if I'm doing a GCA interview and somebody feels the need to like get up and go to the whiteboard, like I'm sort of interested in you're being able to structure your thoughts real time. I'm not interested in trying to follow with whatever's on a whiteboard. That's probably a personal preference. We talked about the thinking too narrowly. So like think globally, not necessarily locally. And then I guess the other thing, and again, so maybe we're going in a funnel from like most preventable into least preventable, but like don't try very hard not to bring biases to the way that you're answering a question. So in other words, if I'm asking about people calling in for additional support, and you say something like, well, I would assume most of those people are old because old people don't know how to use technology as well. Like it may be that my bias, and I happen to agree that like, my parents are not as good with technology as, sort of I am. But I'm not comfortable if you're comfortable making blanket sort of assumptions about the way a cohort of human beings is. Like, where else are you comfortable doing that? If you're on your best day, on your best behavior, doing an interview, exposing some degree of bias. So I don't know that all of those are preventable. So maybe these are not fair asks, but they're at least sort of a list of things that sort of are non-obvious that would be signals to me that maybe you're not the right fit.
And that first one I see very common also. So like where you're asking like GCA, and not everyone's as familiar with GCA, but you're asking a hypothetical question, and then someone is trying to relate to their resume. They're basically essentially answering it with a behavioral based response, because so many people learn behavioral based interviewing of the STAR technique. This is a situation. This is a task. This is action. This is a result. And people get too hung up on that. And I find so many times that people do not answer the question that is asked of them. And one tip that I tell people to do, and I don't know if this is kosher necessarily, but I tell people to actually record their interview on like their phone or a dictation, like a dictation app, and just listen back afterwards. Because when you're in the heat of the moment, you're nervous, and you're just like trying to be like, hey, am I losing Rob here? Am I answering the question? Like, am I talking too much? And like you're preparing for the next question. So you don't always think about the point on hand. And by listening back to your response, first thing I ask my clients is like, did you actually answer the question that was asked of you? And people miss that. So, so I have two more questions for you, and then we'll end here.
I'll try and answer these quicker since we're short on time. Yeah.
Well, these are two quick ones, and we'll wrap up. So, number one, the podcast is called the Sick Career Podcast, and it's because I look for sick advice that you have for my listeners of what they can learn and grow with in their career. So, if you had one piece of sick career advice to provide my listeners, what would it be?
What I have learned on the career front over the years, and to a certain extent, I'm still learning this lesson, but I'm trying to get better at it each day, is this idea of focusing on what you can control.
Yes.
Right. If you think about the times in your career, like when you've gotten to the point where you and I are, like we have a little bit more years behind us. When you think about where you've been the most upset or the most frustrated or whatever, I would guarantee for me, for sure, and for almost everybody, those places where you've been the most frustrated have been things that you cannot control, that you want to somehow control. And so I just now advocate, like, look, I'm going to focus on what I can control. One of the things that I can always control is my emotional reaction to things. And this is not to say that I'm perfect at this particular point, Alan. What I am is able to maybe more quickly catch myself if I'm sort of getting in there. And so what does that mean from a career perspective? Because oftentimes the things that we want the most, more money, more titles, more what have you, are things that are not our control. Those are things that other people have judgment over giving us or not. Well, the first thing we can try and do is sort of suppress the need for those things, right? So in other words, part of what I try and reinforce to myself is in my job, my aim is to meet expectations. That is my goal. My goal is to meet expectations. If other people want to judge me for having gotten, sort of higher rating than that or perform better than that, fantastic. But my aim is to simply meet expectations. But then the other thing is like, look, if I'm interested in more money or advancement, well, the way that I get some leverage on that is to go out into the marketplace and see what I can command in the marketplace, and then I have a point of comparison, right? I have a friend who encouraged the team that worked for him to drive an alternative job conversation to an offer once a year, so that you were not able to get on a treadmill. You were just looking at like, okay, I have this. This is my known quantity. This is an opportunity for me. Okay, I'm making a choice to stay doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's brilliant advice, because then you're control. You can focus on you control making that choice. So I just encourage this: focus on what you can control. You can always control your emotions, and then if you're in a situation where you're not in control, think about, can you control your want, or can you control your action, presuming that you don't get whatever this is, right? And I think, I almost any kind of career advice that I have, or any sort of mentoring conversation or any of this stuff, it does come back to that a little bit of like, well, like, we're worried about this thing. Do you have any influence over it or not? And we sort of are in that vein. So I think at this point, that's the best that I've got.
And that's some sick advice there, Rob. Control the controllables. And last question I have: if people want to reach out to you, you're always looking for great talent. I know you're an approachable guy. How can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn, right? So I think my LinkedIn handle is RJC4, the number 4, me, ME. I am fairly active on LinkedIn. You can find me there. That's generally where I keep a lot of the professional things that I do. And yeah, if you're interested in sort of being in my orbit and want to learn more or want to stay higher, whatever, that's a wonderful place to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, Rob, thank you so much for the generosity. Thanks for the sick advice. And I know we need to go deeper into this. I always love talking shop with you, because I think you're the only one who might have interviewed more people than me at Google. There's definitely lots of people that have, but I know you and I appreciate it as an art form and as like really as a focus of identifying great talent. So thank you for sharing your insight. Thanks for taking some time here with the Acceleration Nation audience.
My absolute pleasure. I so enjoyed it, and I look forward to part 2 whenever we do that in the future.
Sounds good, Rob.